As a quick introduction, my name is Matt Donato. I'm the managing director here for CyberSN. I host these bi-monthly or quarterly Ciso roundtables. We pick a variety of topics to dive into. Specifically, our goal is to create the most collaborative forum where executives and leaders of all different walks of life in and around the security domain can talk more in detail about some challenges and share some insights. The idea is to really drive thought leadership in the community. There's a lot to be learned. It's a fast moving space. There's a lot of changes. The goalpost seems to move every hour, it seems, and something new pops up and hits the business every single day. Today, we're going to dive in a little bit deeper into a conversation around do we need the concept of a virtual CISO or having a VISO or a virtual CISO or an actual CISO is a big topic of conversation. I get asked this quite a bit, and if you're not familiar with CyberSN, we are a large cybersecurity talent acquisition and recruiting firm. That's all we focus in cybersecurity. And I literally 2 or 3 times a week I get asked about a virtual CISO, and at what point is your business in need of one? What will it solve? Will it help with this? Will it help with that? Get a variety of questions, and of course, you talk to the specific folks in technology or in security who maybe own a business. They certainly will ask these questions, and of course, a lot of people will bundle this into the broader bucket of IT, and think that will be all captured by whomever your IT managed service provider is. So we're going to talk about a number of things, and does this solve your problem if you do have a virtual CISO? And at what point do you need to bring in somebody full time to run your security program, and at what level? So a lot of things to unpack there. And then most importantly, how does leveraging a third-party resource or third-party service like an Mssp, like a professional services organization, how does leveraging that and having products in your environment, how does having a virtual CISO really impact that? So without further ado, I want to make some introductions, and rather than me give you the bio overview, I'm gonna turn it over to the panelists to do quick introductions on themselves. I'm sure they'll have some fun answers for you. But why don't we start left to right with Christopher Garretts. Chris.
Yeah, thank you. So I am recently with Datto, but really my background was detection and response. I ran the incident response team at the Air Force CERT for a few years. Stood up counter cyber operations against nation state level hackers. So a lot of deep red teaming and blue teaming kind of activity there. And then founded a company called InfoSight that built a detection and response platform. We really focus on small businesses. So we, especially with Datto, the company that acquired my company, all of our customers are MSP partners. They're service providers that do IT. A lot of times they don't have security background. So I spend a lot of time coaching our partners on delivering security services to small businesses.
Excellent, good synopsis. And how did you get into security? Did you come by way of IT? Did you come from the business side, armed forces?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was mostly military. I think messing around in the 90s, hacking my friends kind of got my attention. And then the military really got me a chance to do that. And I came in 2003 into the Air Force and did crypto systems and IT management. I did Active Directory management in the early days, and then worked my way into security after that.
That's great. And you're an entrepreneur and have had a chance to be part of a lot of different types of organizations on the product side, the services side as well. So Chris Garrett speaks from a lot of different points of views, which is intentional here for this panel discussion. So Chris Furtick, I know we have 2 Chris's for the audience. 2 Chris's don't make a right. I like to make that joke to these guys. They probably are annoyed with it, but I'll keep going. Chris Furtick, why don't you introduce yourself to everybody here?
Yeah, thanks so much for that. So I'm Chris Furtick. I'm Director of Incident Response and Security Engineering at Fortalice Solutions. I also run our vCISO practice. And first off, let me just say, I do not necessarily like the term vCISO. I like the term fractional CISO a little better. We can get into that a little more. It's a bit of semantics, but I think it's important. I come from an incident response background, so my teams are the ones whom you call in the middle of the night when your entire environment has been locked down by ransomware or you had a data breach of of some sort. So I bring that perspective to our clients. I work as a virtual CISO, fractional CISO for several companies at this point. I think that provides a lot of value because we come from a space of here's the oh poop moment, and here's how we respond to it and how we prepare for it. So that's what we're working on now. I've been with Fortalice for about 2 years, but been in professional services and IT security for about 11 years. So really excited to chat with you all today.
Yeah, beautiful. Good segue to last, but certainly not least, RJ Friedman.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Chris and Chris. So RJ Friedman, I'm the CEO of Day One Cyber and Mssp. Prior to Day One Cyber, I was the CISO and head of the managed security division for a large MSP based out of Texas. And before that, I had some various roles with different security vendors. So one of the reasons that I went and I started my own MSSP, sold it to the larger MSP, and then started my MSSP again. But one of the reasons I did all of that was working with those vendors and just seeing that perspective of partners and partnerships that were waning and clients that were in need of services. So that's how I got to where I am.
That's great. How'd you get into the field in general in security?
One of the guys on this panel here, Mr. Chris Garrett's actually. We've known each other since college, but when he started InfoSite, he needed somebody to run sales. He didn't know anybody else because he was coming out of the Air Force. So I pulled the short straw there and got to do that for him.
Gotcha. Problem solving, the gift of gab, or perhaps the gift to listen, maybe both, just depends, right? And so were you one of the friends that he was hacking in the 90s by chance, or was that, did I miss that?
No, that was in the 2000s.
No.
Yeah. Okay, wouldn't that be fun to expose that in this forum? Well, good. So let's dive into it. So let's kind of talk about the driving force to bring in a fractional CISO. And Chris Furtick, I agree with you that fractional CISO may be more applicable for certain types of businesses and sizes and industries. But regardless, let's dive into that a bit and understand at where you see, especially in the small to mid-sized business community, where you see companies where the light goes on or they have an aha moment. What's the triggering event besides obviously the obvious? They get popped, they get hacked, they get compromised, and they have no choice. Tell us a little bit more about your experience there and where you see companies really starting to need to engage a third-party security advisor, an executive to provide oversight or build out a strategy. And we'll start with you in reverse order this time, RJ, and we'll go back through the team.
Sure. Sorry, I thought you were addressing Chris Furtick there. So I was waiting for him to give something great that I could build off of.
Add on to.
Yeah. So can you rephrase again? Just mainly looking for discussion around the decision
specifically
of bringing in a VCISO or
what's the
fractional
decision?
CISO?
What's the driving force behind that? And is this something that we have seen for quite a long time? And I've seen it the last 3 to 5 years, and it's become more and more of a trend. So from your perspective, what is the driving force or forces?
Yeah, so I'll hit on that trend first and why I think it's kind of growing and exploding rather. Certainly over the last couple of years, since COVID, the shortage of professionals in the security industry has become even more of an issue than it was prior. And it already was an issue prior. I remember back in 2017 and 18, reports showing that there were up to 3 million open cybersecurity roles throughout the world, right? And with hundreds of thousands in the US alone. That I think has even grown since then. The driver then is when you look at organizations that have virtual CISOs who can work for multiple companies at one time without having to really compete with a full-time CISO budget, you're able to tap into some of the best talent in the world, people who do this for many organizations and see a lot in a short time frame compared to even a CISO that's at one stagnant organization. But you have that access and that expertise at a fraction, hence the fractional as well, but at a fraction of the price. The overall need and who needs the CISOs and all of that, I mean, that's growing as well. I was reading a recent study where 150 security professionals were surveyed. These are people that come from companies with security teams, yet still over half of those teams didn't have a CISO or a leader of a CISO level that they reported into. So what you see is somebody from a non-security background managing the risk and setting security policy in 60% of cases in companies, even with security teams. And think about that, right? companies with security teams are already somewhat of an exception. Most SMBs that Chris Garrett's works with over at Datto, for example, probably don't really have security teams, and they're fully relying on MSSPs. It's someone I've worked with, people coming from HR. Yeah. I've worked with literal HR directors saying, I drew the short straw. I'm in charge of cybersecurity for the company because it has to do with compliance, I guess, right? Mm. And so the need is ever growing and only compounded by a lot of the global issues that we're seeing around the economy.
Yeah, no, great answer. Ferd, if you want to build on that from your vantage point, what do you see? And again, we're talking about driving forces and when that you reach that inflection point as a business.
Yeah, I don't know that I could put it any better than my friend RJ did. Some of the statistics that you've seen, I think I probably read the same study. It was 38%, don't have a security leader. I don't necessarily subscribe to a model that once you get to X revenue, it's time for a CISO, or you get to X number of employees. For me, it's all about having a security champion. So whether you call that person a CISO, a fractional CISO, or someone else, you've got to have a security champion, someone who understands security in your business. Partnering with an MSSP or a fractional CISO of some sort can really do that and do at a fraction of a cost. Again, to parrot what RJ said, you got to have a plan, and that's what we're talking about here. I go into, again, from an incident response perspective, we get called by new clients who found us because they're in the middle of a breach and they didn't have a security plan. They weren't prioritizing. They didn't have a roadmap. They didn't even have any policies. And now they're in the middle of this oh no moment, and they bring us in, and we're glad to help them at that point. If we've got to get better at planning that out. So I didn't interrupt you, Matt.
So that's it's a good point. I mean, we talk about getting compromised. They're in the middle of an incident. There's an investigation going on. Everyone's all hands on deck in a very reactive, the house is on fire moment. At what point, once you resolve that issue, restore operations, and you're focused on recovery at that point, might be a great segue to talk about with you, Garrett's. What's the stepping back moment? What kind of conversations are you all having about the go forward plan from there? Is it more strategic? Is it more tactical? Is it a blend of the two? And then tell me how a fractional CISO would play in that, or someone from a professional services organization would play in driving that.
Yeah, I think it really depends on what time you were thinking about. If this was a conversation I was having 5 years ago, I'd say the conversation was really about whether people knew that they needed any of this. What do they need for security? I have an antivirus. And then as we've progressed, there's this question of who's driving the need and who's driving what to do. And so the need is being driven by the fact that we see hacks every day. People are scared. A lot of businesses, I know a lot of business owners who know other business owners who had huge losses due to this. So there's a need there. Some still haven't seen that threat. So they're being driven by insurance requirements. Insurance, if you want to be covered under your liability insurance and your comprehensive insurance for your businesses, a lot of times they're now including requirements that you have to do something about security. So we now are in a stage where I think we all think we need it. Most people know they need it. Now the question is, what do I do? And do I have the time to do it? Do I have the resources to do it? And all three of those questions is usually better answered by someone who's done this before. And if you don't have the resources or the time, then going virtual, going to a fractional is probably the best way to go. And most small businesses are doing that these days from what I've seen.
So as the threat landscape evolves, that in itself is an easy, low-hanging fruit justification to say, I think it's time that we engage a third party, somebody who can fractionally support us. But if you're leveraging an MSSP and they're monitoring your environment, focusing on managed detection and response, how do you coexist in that ecosystem? And isn't it in theory part of their SLAs to where they're tasked or charged with that responsibility? And tell me, coming from your vantage point, the pros and the cons to that, because I'm sure this is perhaps maybe a point of contention at some point, right? So tell me a little bit more about what you think. We'll kind of go in reverse order, starting with you, Garrett, because you want to jump on that.
Yeah, I'd say that, you're talking about a difference between a service or a product. A CISO is so much more. It's so strategic. It's like, what do I do? What are my priorities? When you go to an MSSP, and generally, I'm not saying they all do this, but you're buying a product, and that product is, I'm going to detect and respond to bad guys. I'm going to monitor your network. And so their job is not to tell you that monitoring the network is the most important thing. You're buying their service to monitor the network and make sure it's secure. When you go to a Ciso, you're thinking more strategically, what are my most important things? Maybe monitoring isn't my number one. Maybe first I need to make sure I have a firewall and I have some door locks in place before I hire a guard. All those things are important, but there is a progression to it.
Excellent. And do you feel like they reach a certain verdict you want to add to that?
Yeah, what I would say is when I take my car into the mechanic, I absolutely expect them to be able to service the oil, change the oil, change all the plugs, things like that. I would never, ever, ever want them to design an engine. I would never, ever want them to do that, right? MSSPs are great for doing the day-to-day tasks, but I would not necessarily want them to be able to design the vehicle I'm going to take down the road.
Yeah, that's great. So do you feel like in your experience, the fractional CISO compared to that of an MSSP, the chain of custody, obviously the MSSP is there to be more tactical, operational, and then in theory, the virtual CISO, the fractional CISO is there to be a consultant, to be a guiding light, to drive awareness, strategy. Where do they meet in the middle? And through your experience, where's that inflection point, or where do those two rub up against one another? And then when is the aha moment to say, all right, we actually need to bring in people who are hands-on, who are going to be focused day in and day out, and we actually need to bring in-house some talent. So let's talk about that in greater detail if we can.
Yeah,
RJ, you want to take that one? Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, for me, it becomes a point where a fractional CISO can help you hold the MSSP accountable, right? It's an accountability issue. The CEO, the CFO, they don't know the things they should be asking. They don't even know the graph or the dashboard that you sent them, right? They don't know how to interpret it because they don't understand security. If you've got someone who can interpret what MSSP is telling you and present that up to board level or C level, it makes it much easier.
Yeah, that's good. RJ?
Yeah, to touch kind of on all of that, that's one of the main things that I've seen and had concerns about as someone coming from, a vendor that worked with a lot of partners that just tried to sell this one thing, right? Let's say DLP. If you go in and you want to sell DLP to an organization and that's all you think about, that's always going to be, the most glaring issue that you drive with, even though that customer might not have, if we would talk about the CIS security framework, for example, they might not have 1.1 finished, which is having an asset inventory. They might not have even addressed it or started it. How are you going to protect data if you don't know where it is? Well, it doesn't matter to a lot of vendors. It doesn't matter to a lot of MSSPs either. And they all go in, around CIS 11 monitoring the network. When there's 155 controls, 145 of them aren't monitoring, you need somebody that's able to go in and tell you which ones are the best ROI. And you really need to start there. And it's a problem. I mean, when, my last role, as I was talking with many customers and vCISO for many customers, we ran into people who are like, honestly, just give us the top 5 things. We can't handle the rest of it. We don't even care. What are the best 5 things to do? And I ran into that same problem during the election when we, with Google, did a panel and a white paper on election security with the DNC and RNC and a couple other organizations. They asked all of us, what's the one thing that you could do in cybersecurity? And I was like, one thing, if you're going to live into one thing, then the one thing is don't do this yourself. Don't try this at home.
Right.
That's the one thing, is to find an expert that'll tell you all the other things to focus on. That wasn't even an option they gave us. And of course it was Google, and they were pitching their authenticator app. And so the one thing that they wanted everyone to pick was multi-factor authentication. And that won. But I'm happy to say that mine came out, I think, with the second most votes, even though it wasn't an original option, because really there's no one thing. And any vendor who comes in, and those MSSPs who come in just focusing on one thing, it's very important to realize that's all that they're doing. And you need someone to hold them accountable, but find the other things that are more important to address.
Yeah. So how do you hold them accountable? If you are a fractional CISO and you're there driving the strategy of the organization, you're there to focus on awareness and programmatically start to build out the building blocks. Is that comms strategy? Is that communication back and forth? Is that just between those two? I mean, at what point do you pull in the business and kind of push the accountability to stakeholders or business process owners internally and share that, I guess, that accountability with your third parties, whomever they may be?
Yeah, I think in terms of holding MSSPs accountable, there's both qualitative and quantitative ways to do it. But from a quantitative standpoint, looking at the KPIs that they had put together already, if they don't, that's a huge red flag. And a lot of MSSPs don't lead with indicators like that in terms of how long it takes them to get to an incident and resolve it, how many incidents they've had. If you go into a company, and I have, and you ask them those types of questions, what's your MSSP shared with you in the last month or on a monthly basis around these numbers, they're like, I don't know.
No idea.
That's normally not a great sign.
Right.
On the qualitative standpoint, a lot of it goes into communications. I often think that that's the most important thing that an MSSP can do well is communicate, even if they're not that great on a lot of the other stuff on the technical aspect. Knowing that they're there and that they're responsive, that means so much to so many customers, and will ultimately be one of the most important things.
And it is expected for a virtual CISO or fractional CISO to set up the cadence of communication and to really map out, here are the set time frames or the time, the set aside time that we're going to spend with one another, and here are the things that we're going to talk about, so everyone's prepared. And of course, there's the off chance they're going to call you and there's going to be an issue or something of that regard that's out of schedule. But is that what's being led by your third party, or is that being led by that of the vCISO?
I'd love to see when they take ownership of it and there's already a plan in place. That's an ideal scenario, but it's ultimately up to the vCISO or whoever's in charge of security at the organization to hold vendors accountable.
Yeah, that's good. Anybody want to add to that? Do you guys agree, disagree?
Yeah, from my perspective, I absolutely want them to take the lead, and very rarely do they do that. To RJ's point earlier, one of the most important things they can do is communicate with me, and it's often the most overlooked. So when I first come in for a company and start working in a fractional CISO capacity, I demand a sync every 2 weeks, right? We're getting to know each other, we're shaking hands, we're kissing babies, we're understanding who each other are. I want to meet with them every week. It may only be 30 minutes. It may just be a quick sync on what we saw and what we're working on, but I want to establish that relationship. I do that with the business as well. The rest of the business leaders, not necessarily about security, but I want to understand what their projects are. But I'm with RJ. If you come to me with some statistics and a dashboard, let's have that sync set up already. If I had to come in and ask for it, that is a huge red flag for me that this may not be the right partner.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Chris Garrett, do you anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think that was kind of covered it. I was going to say RJ did a good job on that, but yeah.
So to build on that, where do you think we draw the line? So if you're a fractional CISO, you're being brought in, is like in every pro serve organization, is scope creep something that happens sooner rather than later? I have to imagine that's probably, guys, we did not design this to be set up this way. I was supposed to be here 15, 20 hours a month, and I'm doing that a week now. And so obviously there's a cost associated with that and a lack of clarity perhaps, but perhaps maybe give us some insight to where that happens more often than not, and with who?
I know a lot of CISOs that are full-time that don't get a lot of sleep. So I feel for any fractional trying to set boundaries around what you're supposed to ask them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Boundaries is a good word.
Yeah. So Furtick, you're focusing on a few clients at this moment, maybe even more. I mean, how are you drawing the line in the sand, and what does that framework or that structure look like to where here are my 3 swim lanes? Outside of that, I'll help in what I can ad hoc, but are you thoroughly defining that up front and then setting expectations and managing to that?
Yeah, so we attempt to do all of those things, and rarely do they work, right? This new person is a new body, and we're paying them an hourly to come in and help. So throw compliance their way or throw this other thing their way. And we work with clients the best that we can, but it's very difficult. If anyone else has a better strategy, I would love to hear it. But and clients often underestimate how much time they'll need. They're like, oh, we only need you, 15 hours a week or something else, because we don't even have security problems now. What are you going to come in and create more problems for us? And then when I come in and do a CIS top 18, I'll show them, here are all the things that you're not doing. Oh, by the way, that pen test that you thought you were going to do, that's the very last control. Let's spend our money at other places. Once you start showing them those things, it becomes really clear that they need additional help.
Yeah, and then I guess you have to go back to them to start to drive some priorities, or maybe even quantify the priorities. And so let's talk about the prioritization of that, because I think that's a perfect segue to, you got to fight the battles that you could win sometimes. And so where do you go, and how do you go, and who does that person? Is it the person that brought you in? If it was a partner and you really don't know the stakeholders or the C-suite on the other end, tell me about the approach and how you're having those conversations. And maybe this is a good one for you, RJ. We can go back around.
Yeah, sure. So first though, on the scope creep question, that's one I've seen it both from the vCISO and from the MSSP perspective and the vendor perspective. When a vendor goes in or an MSSP goes in to deliver one specific thing, but all of the prerequisites aren't done first, then it becomes, well, in order for us to do multi-factor authentication, we need to clean up Active Directory. And that's a huge project in its own because Active Directory hasn't been cleaned up in 20 years. And so that's a very common thing that happens when you buy point solutions rather than when you purchase or buy a strategy, right? Because when you're buying a strategy, you might have already known that the Active Directory was toast and needs to be maybe even just scrapped and redone. And you start there, right? Because it's much more important to do that now than it is to do something for that requires it down the line. Much easier to do so and more cost effective as well. So when it comes to scope creep, those are, you see it from all sides. What was the next topic, Matt?
Yeah, it's moving to, I guess when you start to bite off a small piece of the apple and then you work your way and then they think they have a set of priorities and you're like, actually, no, we need to re-rank these priorities and work our way from the top down. And then how do you communicate that into who?
Yeah. And that's tough because sometimes you have someone in there that's maybe, an IT contact. And this IT person has, I've got 15 years of IT experience. What do you mean? I know exactly what I need to do. Go and look at my Palo Alto firewall for me and make sure that the ACLs are right. Well, you don't do security awareness training. You don't have multi-factor authentication turned on anywhere. These are just the things I can see from a spaceship, by the way. These aren't even things that I needed to do an in-depth risk assessment on. Why aren't you starting there? Because it's going to cost 1/10 as much to do both of those things as it is to look at your fancy firewall, which is already probably the most effective piece of your security stack because that's the only thing that you actually knew, right? That is hard. That is really, really hard. And that's where quantification, I think, really comes in. And making sure that you're speaking to the right stakeholders is very vitally important there as well. So if you're able to go then and show the CEO or the board and say, look, your risk here is $1 million because 80% of threats come in through phishing attempts. We know that just based on the statistics, 82% or whatever. So security awareness training, easily one of the best ROIs that you could do in any organization. And it'll cost you $3 a user to fix. It's a no-brainer when you actually look at the math of it, right? Yep, but egos are hard to overcome, but the best way I've found is just using math.
Yeah, data will tell a story, right? And so, Garrett, what do you think? What's your take on that? Is that a similar approach or methodology that you have when you go into a similar situation?
Yeah, I mean, the big thing is, how are we even going to measure risk? Most organizations, they want, like insurance companies use numbers. And so it's like, how many incidents are happening to companies in your industry? Most organizations have a hard time doing quantitative risk because they just don't have the numbers. And internally, just to your organization, you only have the numbers and you only have the data for your organization. It has nothing to do with everybody else. And so oftentimes we do qualitative, which is let's ask, how secure do we feel? And oftentimes that's just it's a feeling. And if you don't have experience in this, that feeling's not going to be very good. That qualitative answer's not going to be very good. And so, I think that first step, that first discovery call that you have with an entity, with an organization, to try to get a feeling for where they're at on maturity, where they're at on, what they have, that gives you a good idea of what that entry point might be. And so as I said, that first discovery call, there's a bunch of things you can find out and you get a good feeling of whether they're starting from the bottom or they're actually pretty good.
In that discovery call, are you requiring that they bring all the stakeholders to that conversation, or are you doing one-on-one interviews, or is it a combination of the two?
And I think, it's probably different for a vCISO, which I've never been doing that kind of work. But when we look at detection and response, one of the things that we try to understand from a risk point of view, and not just a risk, but a cost, is if I'm going to monitor your network and, all your doors are open and you have, broken windows, and I'm going to monitor your your house,
Yeah.
like that's going to be a lot worse situation than if you had a fence. And so if we just use that analogy. And so what we try to do is try to figure out, ask certain questions to say, what's the state of this network? Is it secure?
Yep. Right.
What am I gonna find when I start looking at it? And how much work is this going to be? So those are questions we always try to ask. It's not necessarily be a good or bad thing, and just to try to understand, is this going to be a trouble network, or is this going to be a fairly quiet network?
Yeah, that's great. Furtick, I think you want to add to that, please.
Yeah, just one thing to think about here, and we're talking around the subject, but a great security practitioner and one that you want to partner with as a fractional CISO will be a fantastic storyteller. So when you're talking to this person, you'll hear them use analogies, you'll hear them take numbers and make them digestible for the C-suite, because the C-suite, I go and talk to them about MFA and all these other things that your eyes glaze over and they don't have any idea what I'm talking about.
Right.
Once I talk to them about strong authentication and what that means, then 38% of ransomware comes from unsecured remote access. When you start talking in numbers, things that they understand, the business understands, and can tell them a great story, it becomes a lot easier to have these conversations. I come from a technical background, as many security practitioners do, and that's a tool that has really helped me. It's really difficult for some folks to develop.
Yeah, that's good. That's great insight. And are you, in that instance, do you think, well, let's talk about how we got to this point. Meaning, we're seeing a lot of changes right now in the landscape. I'm going to move this conversation along a little bit. I'm going to talk about a couple of different things. One being the insurance market has changed. It used to be pretty soft. Now it's pretty hard. Insurance companies, like Chris Garrett said, they live and die in numbers. Everything is very scientific and methodical. So with that being said, how has the insurance market hardening over the last 2 to 3 years changed? I'm sure it's impacted the DFIR space, specifically IR, MDR. But let's talk about how that will then put the pressure on the SMB specifically to harden their defenses and put a strategy in place. And what does that look like? Give some of the people here some insight to what that entails. Maybe this is a good one to start with you, Ferda, because I think this is right up your wheelhouse.
Yeah, I've been working through insurance renewal for a mortgage company over the past week or so. So first off, if you haven't renewed cyber insurance recently, your CFO is in for a shock. So $2 million worth of coverage 2 years ago cost about $8K for this company premium. Today, we got the most recent quote, it's $58K. So same amount of coverage and same deductible, wow. no change, but $58,000 now. So that's a $50,000 increase to the bottom line. We're also seeing some companies unable to even get cyber insurance if they don't have multi-factor authentication in place. So they're sending out questionnaires. And oh, by the way, it's not just check boxes. Do you have MFA and keep going? No, they're sending auditors out and say, what tools are you using? Show me the controls. Almost like a PCI audit. Show me these things that you have in place, because we're not even going to give you insurance if you don't have these things in place. So cyber insurance has taken a big hit with all of the ransomware cases. Average ransomware case cost to recover from that is $1.8 million. And that's across all verticals, but that doesn't even measure your brand reputation, right? What happens to your clients when you've lost their data? What confidence have you lost in them? So the insurance space has gone nuts recently, and rightly so. I think that will be the single biggest driver for security controls and tooling over the next 5 years. If you want cyber insurance, you're going to have multi-factor. You're going to have all these things put into place. Else you're going to have to self-insure, and that's an option. You just have to weigh what makes the most sense for you. But I'd love to hear what the rest of the panel is seeing.
Yeah, RJ, Chris.
Sure. I mean, as Chris mentioned, Garrett's mentioned very early on. I mean, Furtick's spot on with this, but as Garrett's mentioned early on, this has become a primary driver for SMBs. If they didn't care about cybersecurity, well, it doesn't matter because your insurance company does. And the CFOs are fortunately insisting that companies maintain their cyber insurance policies, even when they're going up by 50K in a year or a couple of years. But it's a huge driver. And, for the most part, what I've seen is all of the questionnaires which these vendors send out for their third-party risk management, or that these insurance companies are sending out, they've gotten a lot more robust. They've gotten a lot more robust over the years. Before, it used to be, do you have a security program? Do you promise? All right, have a good day. Here you go. Here's some insurance. Right. Now it's going down into the details of, how do you do monitoring? Do you have EDR installed, right? And that's generally a pretty sophisticated control compared to a lot of other controls out there, and they're going deep. Hundreds of questions I've seen some of these questionnaires.
Yeah, absolutely. And so is it safe to assume that are the insurance companies mandating what products and solutions you're using, or is it still agnostic? No. And I'm sure you have autonomy to make these decisions as long as it's deemed adequate and they do their audits and inspecting what they're expecting for this policy. Are there certain baseline things that you have to have? I think we're talking about that around it now, but so tools aren't being pushed down your throat at all.
I think, families of tools have been. Are you doing EDR? Do you have email security in place? Do you have DLP in place? Those sorts of things. The most that I've seen is drop down menus to select the vendors that you're using. And if you're using one that isn't listed, I'm sure that's a negative point.
All right, yeah, that's good. Anything to add from that, Chris Garretts?
No, I mean, it's constantly evolving, and each company is a little bit different. I've seen my premiums go up for my company every time we did a renewal. So I think everyone's starting to get it. I think I actually was talking to some insurance companies about, providing capabilities or services or products back in 2015, 2016 timeframe. Mm-hmm. And one of the underwriters, I forget which firm it was, but they basically flat out told me, like, well, our premiums won't cover this. Like, we don't charge enough for us to even go through the complexity of verifying this stuff. Mm-hmm. And so, Vertex said, if it's going from 8K to 58K, you can do a whole lot more with 58K than you can 8K. And now you can start sending an auditor and not lose money on your own policy. So I think as that premium goes up, it's not just a bad thing for us to absorb the cost. It's also, I think in general, even though I hate paying it, more money every year, it is making us more secure in general as an industry, because it is driving so many companies to start adopting things they should have been doing already.
Yeah,
I think that was Chubb or Liberty Mutual, Chris. It was one of those. Mm-hmm. And I mean, isn't that telling? The Chubb is number one for cyber insurance. Liberty Mutual's up there. And they were the ones saying, oh, we can't cover these costs. To tell them before they go. And speaking of analogies, one of my honorary titles Chris gave me at a Black Hat was Chief Analogy Officer. But to use the analogy, car insurers don't want to go and insure a car that has sugar in the gas tank. So why does a cyber insurer want to come and insure a company that's already hacked? And that was a big problem that we were solving with InfoSight and trying to work with those insurance companies on doing. If you can go in and matter-of-factly say, no, you look pretty clear of compromise at the moment, that's a huge sigh of relief and should have resulted in a big discount for a lot of these insurers.
So it's safe to assume in order to be able to get a degree of insurance and coverage that you need, even if you've been popped, there's a number of steps that you have to take to get, I guess, cleansed, if you will, to be in that better position. So what is the capital investment to get there? Because if you don't have the resources internal to do that, who are you relying on?
Yeah, typically you bring in partners. Sometimes even the insurance company are suggesting who they're broking it for you. But making sure you're clean is really difficult, right? First off, containing an incident is difficult, understanding the scope and where we're going. But to say that you're clean one way or the other without putting in a lot of tools and a lot of time is really difficult to do. So a lot of insurance won't even touch someone who has had an active breach, over the past 2 or 3 months, because they don't know until they've seen an independent third party. Here's what we did. Here's how we know everything's eradicated. They won't even touch it.
Of that risk assessment, I would assume, and that will reveal some telling data. Okay, and then at what point does the virtual CISO, assuming that you have one, or maybe if you don't have one, do you then decide to bring one as a start to be the guiding light? Do you just turn it completely over to that individual and say, good luck, Godspeed, let me know what you need and brief me every month or every quarter?
I'll go first on this one because it sounds like you're asking if a virtual CISO is an easy button, and that's not how this works. That's not how any of this works, Matt. You have to empower that person first off, right? You have to give them the budget. You have to give them tools that they need. But a virtual CISO can come in and help prioritize where the function should be. The virtual CISO is not the person that you call because you had ransomware last week and you want them to come fix everything, because that's not necessarily the time. You need a breach coach at that point. Sometimes your insurance company will provide that. Sometimes you can get that from a third party, but it's a difficult situation. But you should think of the vCISO as a person, the captain driving the ship, right? They're not the folks who are rowing the boat. They're not the folks doing firewall reviews. Typically, they're the folks who are driving, business outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And so do you think there's a point where we've talked about scope creep, but in the context of hours of dedication to an account to service a customer as a fractional CISO, at what point do you say this actually belongs in-house? And do you get involved as a fractional CISO helping design what that role or set of roles look like? And how high touch is that, or how hands-off are you in that case? It's a good one for you, Ferda, because I know this is something that you probably have come across recently.
I have 2 interviews set up this afternoon for helping build out an internal team. So the mortgage company that I'm working for, I've defined some roles. Here are the roles that I would put. Here's about what it's going to cost. And HR and CFO looks like, is a security person going to cost this much money? It absolutely is, because talent is scarce at this point. But yes, we absolutely try to develop that. And our ultimate goal is to work ourselves out of a job. So if there's a good, solid team there, and you have a security champion, maybe that person's a director. Again, I don't care about the title. As long as they're directing the activities and driving the ship, that's what you're looking for.
So you'd eventually wean yourself off to replace yourself at some point, and I assume you map that out in time, or you just keep it open-ended based on what happens and how long it takes.
Yeah, I want to be a phone a friend at that point, right? Yeah, the ship is running at a steady state. You got a problem, the ship, shoot me an email. Let's have a quick conversation, and let's talk about bigger strategy. But if you've got me, again, working through firewall logs or something, that's not a very good use of my time. It's like paying the electrician to come, trim your grass. It just doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Mm-hmm.
Gentlemen, you want to build on that?
Yeah, I'll take this one. It's very interesting going from, I was at the Air Force, which has millions of people, and the U.S. military. My security operations center that I was in had 370 people total monitoring the network, and we didn't even do IT security. We didn't do policy. We didn't do any of the other aspects. We only did the detection and response function of NIST, and we had 370 people. My company InfoSight, we grew to about 30 people, and I was the CEO / help desk / CISO. So I was wearing 3 hats. And a lot of companies still do that. They usually just have a hat and someone wears it, and hopefully it's not your most junior person who just knows about computers. And then, at some point you have to decide, like, if I don't have that skill set, do I need to outsource? Do I need to hire somebody? We just did it through an annual audit, and that was usually something we could provide to our customers and provide to our insurance company as we grew. Now I'm part of Datto, which has 2,000 employees and 40 to 50 people in their IT department, and that's not even detection and response. Like, we've got external services and all sorts of stuff going into that to feed that machine to keep everybody secure, and all the different portions of the company secure. So lots of different sizes. There's no. I don't think there's a model out there that says what you should be.
Yeah.
But I've experienced 3 different ones.
So I'm going to segue. We had a couple questions come in. One was around vendor contracts, third-party risk, fourth-party risk. Who plays a role? Who's accountable to what? Obviously, ultimately, the organization starts with them. They're accountable. But as a fractional CISO or as a third party, do you get involved in those elements? And let's talk about that just a minute, just to address the question.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Even with the new CIS version 8, one of the bigger differences was between version 7.1 and 8 was that they added third-party risk management to the Center for Internet Security's cybersecurity framework. Over the past couple of years, we've all seen many headlines that pertain to third-party risk management, vendor risk management, but it's absolutely a part of any holistic cybersecurity program, and thus something that the vCISO needs to focus on.
Absolutely. Anybody else want to add to that? I thought I got another question your way. All right, so remediation, obviously a big conversation. Who owns what? You lack the adequate resources internally, but yet remediation based on your assessment is obviously a clear priority for you all at some point in that chain of custody. So who owns the remediation? At what point do you have to engage another third-party service? Who do you go to for that? Let's talk about that for a sec. RJ, feel free to jump in if you want.
Sure. Likewise, right? I think that's something that, and as Chris was talking about how much the vCISO does, and trying to wean away, if you're in an organization that can afford that, Absolutely. And that should be the goal, to bring in the talent that can do this. Some organizations, smaller organizations, I think are for better or worse going to have to outsource forever. I think actually it's for better. I don't think that if you're a small, mom and pop tire store, that you need to build a security operations center ever,
Yeah,
right?
right.
I don't think if you're a large tire store that you should do that either. If I'm a $100 million MSSP, I'm not going to go make a tire department just because I have to drive and see my clients. Right.
Yep, right.
So likewise, I think that it makes sense often to have, a few people kind of at the top internal if they have full-time jobs and enough work to do for around the clock. But generally when it comes to things, like what you just mentioned, that has to be outsourced. And there are so many great partners out there, but there's
right.
so many bad ones too. Over another stat, over 50% of security professionals, I think it's actually like 58% or something like that, are not happy with their current MSSP.
That's the staggering
And
scary data
80%
point.
and
Yeah.
80% of security professionals are considering outsourcing or already do. So when you look at that, and half of people aren't happy with their MSSPs, and I think we've all, from different perspectives, seen many reasons why. And I think, I think what we're going to get into, Matt, you want us to maybe discuss how do you vet and how do you understand,
Yeah, that
who
was
to
definitely,
work with.
that's exactly where we're going.
Companies, the MSPs, for example, that have one team that does both IT and security. I think that's a pretty big red flag. One of the best practices in the security industry that we often preach to clients as vCISOs even is to separate the duties between IT and security. IT are your chefs and your wait staff, and security is that agency coming in to make sure that you pass your health checks. You need to keep them separate. They're not the same skill set. They haven't been the same skill set for 20 years, despite people often putting IT and security in one group. Just because you went to med school doesn't mean you could perform surgery on my heart. You're a podiatrist. Stick to the feet. Let us work on the heart.
Got it. Love it. You guys all talk about telling stories in 7th grade language. You guys seem to have some good ones. I like it. Furtick or Garrett, anything you wanted to add to that? Talk about vetting and the qualifying of third parties and who makes it, who fakes it till they make it, kind of thing.
It's a huge problem, to RJ's point. I don't talk to folks and hear them say, I really love my MSSP. They provide everything that I need and I don't have to ask for anything. No, I hear them talking about it's like going to a deli. And every time I ask for something, I have to explain my environment to them once again. So I think it just takes time. First off, you've got to map out your requirements. So if you're going to purchase an MSSP or engage with one, map out what your requirements are going to be. Do you expect 24/7? Do you need it all based in US, or can you have a follow the sun type model? Those are things that you need to be asking. A fractional Ciso can help with that. Another third party, independent third party can help with that. But they really need to understand your business. And for all sake, please make sure you find someone that's a business enabler. That's what you need to be looking for. Security gets oftentimes, they're the department of no, you can't do this.
Right.
No, you can't do that. If you've got an MSSP that comes in with that type of mindset, you're setting yourself up for failure.
Yeah, and is that no oftentimes to the business itself, to the leaders, to the executives, all the above, none of the above? Yeah.
Any new technology, security has the mindset of no. It's been that way for years and years. We're changing it. We're getting so much better. We're not there yet, but I know some MSSPs are like, oh, you want to add this on? That's going to be an additional cost, or you're going to have to do this extra thing, or we weren't figuring that in our quote. Here's the other thing that we need to do, and things like that. Sometimes there is time for renegotiation, but it shouldn't be an a la carte. If you want an extra French fry, you shouldn't have to pay another $10,000.
Yeah, absolutely. Gentlemen, you want to add to that, or did he nail it? I think he nailed it.
I think he nailed it.
Garrett's got, yeah, okay, great. One last question is around compliance standards. Clearly, as a fractional CISO or even as an MSSP, sometimes compliance standards and key privacy regulations don't necessarily fall into the purview. And so, who is tasked and accountable to improving your compliance standards within your organization, knowing that they even understand what they are? Is it your third-party legal counsel? Is it a third-party risk counsel of some sorts? Like, where does that fall? Who owns it? Who should share it? And again, in the context of a fractional CISO, is this under their purview and one of the top priorities in scope? I'll
I
jump
think
at
in
that at
general, the
same
person
time.
that owns, yeah, I think the person who owns a risk at each organization is kind of determined by who, kind of runs that organization. A lot of them that I see, usually like there's a CFO, and a CFO is the head financial officer. Oftentimes they own risk. And I've seen CISOs report into the CFO. I've seen, sometimes CISOs report into IT, and sometimes they report into risk. I think it's probably more efficient to go to risk.
I think everybody's thumbs down on the CISO report into the CIO. We got a bunch of those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But ultimately someone owns that. As a virtual or an external service, you have to act as advisors. We can recommend things all day long. Not everyone listens to us.
Right.
And ultimately it's a business decision if they want to do it or not.
Yeah, great. RJ, Chris Furtick, you want to add to that?
Sure. Yeah, and I'll touch on the reporting structure too, because this is something that often I'm sure Furtick has stories to add. That you go into a lot of companies, like I mentioned earlier, and I was working with someone in HR who was head of security, right? And this poor guy, I felt for him. He was a smart guy, but he was really damn good at HR. And he'd been doing HR for 25 years, and he barely knew how to work his computer. Like that's not the person you put in charge of cybersecurity. And unfortunately, the CEO in that case made that mistake of delegating it to the wrong person, rather than the CEO saying, you know what, I don't have anyone on staff. I need to own this until we find someone that's competent and capable. In most cases, the CISO should report to the CEO and have at least quarterly reporting to the board. One of the few, what I deem acceptable exceptions to that is reporting to the CFO. I think as the owner of risk, that the CFO is generally the owner of risk. The CFO is a great leader to report into, even for a CISO, as kind of a second or third best option. But it really depends on the size of the company. A large company is going to have a CIRO, right? A chief information risk officer, for example. That may fall under the CISO. The CISO may fall under the CIRO. It's really, I don't think that there's an exact science that we can follow there to show what best practices are. But I think what we can say matter of factly is that the board needs visibility, the CEO needs visibility of things that the CISO is bringing to the table. And if that CISO is using validated and qualitative or quantitative analysis, rather, hopefully the decisions that the business makes are going to be pretty sound.
Yeah, excellent. Chris Furtick, you want to bring that home?
Just one quick thing I'll add to that spaghetti of who should report where. If you factor in GDPR, it becomes even more exponentially challenging, right? GDPR requires a data privacy officer. They have to report up through legal and things like that. So these are all things that you've got to keep in mind. Do I think the fractional CISO should own compliance? They shouldn't necessarily. They should absolutely advise on it. They should absolutely advise on policy because they're going to be ultimately held responsible to making sure that we're doing what the policy says. So
yeah, some people are chatting that depends on the CIO. Some CIOs really understand it, get it, they prioritize it. They don't allow it to conflict with their objectives. Robbing Peter to pay Paul, so to speak, from a budget perspective. So, and some CFOs, as Jason Cox is mentioning, can actually be more of a roadblock than that of someone who understands it, just because it's more costly. So I guess it all depends on it's the MBA school answer. It all depends, right? And the right person that you have. That's good. All right, so we've got a number of questions that were asked. Is there anything that you three wanted to add that we did not touch on that we can address as we bring this home? I think we've touched on a lot, and I think this has been some really good material. And I want to thank the three of you for joining us. Much like the airlines strive to do, we try to say we're going to arrive at 1 o'clock, get there at 12:55, get 5 minutes back in your day. Assuming that no one else has any additional questions. Again, I just wanted to, on behalf of CyberSN, wanted to thank you three for joining, and all of those that attended this roundtable. Thank you again. We'll be back in September for our next iteration. And thanks again, gentlemen.